Hello Create Schools. Now I want to tell you about the second video in the Who is to Blame for the Cold War chapter. Chapter 4. I want to talk about the summit conferences of 1945 that happened right after the end of World War II. So go ahead and get a piece of paper and a pen and copy this down. And when you're ready, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we kind of talked about in the last video the beginning of the breakdown of the alliance with the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and when there's no longer the enemy there, you start thinking about maybe this person isn't my friend anymore. So we've got our big three. We've got Roosevelt, who's here. There is democracy. He believes democracy in Eastern Europe is good, and he wants good relationships with the USSR. So that's here. Then we've got Stalin, who's trying to stop Stalin from imposing communist on Eastern Europe. And then we've got Stalin, who's wanting the security of the USSR and wants a buffer zone, and he wants part of the Polish territory. So if you remember, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was talking about how there was the Nazi-Soviet Pact was with Germany and the USSR, agreeing not to invade each other, and at the end they were going to split Poland. So you even knew way back then that one of Stalin's goals is the Polish territory and get more of Poland. So here we've got the three, and we're going to call these the big three. Again, we have a second big three. We had our big three from World War I, and now we have our big three after World War II. But now we have the USSR is one of them, and France is no longer really discussed. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Make sure you copied down these notes. Okay, so then we have our Yalta Conference. It was in February 1945. It is very important that you know it's in February because the Potsdam Conference is also in 1945, and you need to remember that the Yalta was first, and then we had a few months in between. So here we've got our big three: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Go ahead and write those words down with the dates, and we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so the agreements in the Yalta Conference was Germany was going to be divided into 4 zones. And we're going to talk about this a lot later, so don't worry if you don't get everything. 1 zone, so 1/4 is going to Britain, 1 is going to France, 1 is going to the USA, and then finally the USSR. And so that is why Eastern Germany was communist. I'm hoping that most of you still know that, because it was divided after World War II and given to the USSR. They all agreed that the war criminals, the Nazi war criminals, would be brought to trial. They said they were going to set up a provincial government in Poland. They all agreed that they were going to help the freed people of Europe set up a democratic and self-governing country. So basically anyone that basically was having problems and had a lot of battles in there, they were going to help those areas become a democratic and self-governing country. Then the United Nations was set up. All 3 agreed to join the United Nations. So this is a replacement of the League of Nations, because as we all know, the League of Nations failed, and its final failure was World War II. So they, instead of trying to revive the League of Nations, they start a new one called the United Nations. And they all agree to keep world peace. We still have the United Nations, and so it is actually working pretty well. Because everyone is involved in the United Nations, not just a basic few people. It doesn't matter, remember, if you weren't a peace-loving country, or you weren't this, or you weren't that, and the selection from the League of Nations was so small it made problems. So when everyone joins the United Nations, it works much better. Then they were setting up a commission to look in reparations. Because if you think about it, reparations, they're paying the money, was one of the biggest problems that Germany had, that Hitler was able to actually use against the League of Nations and help band the people together of Germany in order to fight. So they're saying, okay, let's look at how reparations is going to be handled. How are we going to do this? Okay? But they also agreed that Eastern Europe would be Stalin's Soviet sphere of influence. Now, we've got the elections here, and we've got the Eastern Europe Soviet sphere of influence here. So in Churchill and Roosevelt's mind, that would mean that Stalin would be helping Eastern Europe set up a free and democratic self-governing countries. Now maybe, when they're democratic and they choose to become communist, that would be fine, but they would be self-governing, they'd be autonomous, they would have their own ideas. Where Stalin, on the other hand, was thinking, ooh, my sphere of influence, I can make them all become communist, I can rule them, and I can have them be a buffer zone. We'll talk more about a buffer zone later. If you don't get that concept right now, you just keep that in the back of your mind. And one of the big things that was also agreed is Stalin would enter the war with Japan once Germany surrenders. So I need to explain a few things about this. During World War II, there was actually 2 wars going on. There was the war with Germany that everyone is thinking about, with the Nazis and the concentration camps and all of that. But then there was also a war against Japan. Now, Japan and Germany were allies together. And some of you may or may not know about the Battle of Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, which belongs to the United States. If the United States was practicing isolationism, hopefully you remember that as well, and so the United States did not come immediately into the war. But once Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the president at the time, Roosevelt, decided, oh, well, then we're going to have to go ahead and enter the war or fight against Japan. So there are these 2 wars going on. Stalin was only fighting against the Nazis. He was not fighting against Japan. So they said, okay, so once we get this all taken care of, we need to fight against Stalin. We'd like you to fight against Japan. And so, big point to remember, and this is why I took a long time making sure Japan was understood. At the Yalta Conference, they went very favorably towards Stalin because Roosevelt really wanted Stalin's help in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, that is Japan. Okay? So pause here. I've just thrown a lot of things at you, and so I hope that wasn't too much. The book also explains it very well. If you need another just reminder, explains it slightly different with the picture slightly different. But go ahead and write all of those notes down, and we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so the big disagreement was over Poland. And as I had said previously, one of the things that Stalin really wanted was Poland. And so he wanted to move the Polish borders westward. And so that means the Polish borders would go into Germany. They would move west into Germany. But then also Stalin would have more of the Polish lands. Churchill really didn't agree to this, but he knew that the Red Army was still placed, so Stalin's army was still in Eastern Europe. And we'll talk a lot more about this in just a second into the next video. So it's okay if you don't quite understand it. Most of it will become clearer as we go through the chapter, and we'll go back and discuss this. Roosevelt was unhappy, but he also agreed because Roosevelt didn't want Stalin to interfere with Greece. For some reason, the Americans really liked Greece, and I like to say maybe it's because Roosevelt's wife liked a vacation in Greece. I don't know. But anyway, that's just a theory or something to try to have my brain figure out why does Roosevelt want Greece so much. And so basically he said, I'll give you Poland if you make sure we get Greece. Okay, and so the new borders of Poland were drawn, and they were drawn on the rivers the Oder and the Neisse, or however that river's pronounced. So anyway, the Poland comes up a lot as a 4-point question, and when you're looking for enough points to discuss about it, when you name these rivers, these will give you 1 or 2 points depending on what the question is. So it's good to know the names of these rivers because it's one of those easy things you can throw out there for a 4-point question. Okay, go ahead and pause this video and go ahead and take those notes down. Okay, the next thing we have is the Potsdam Conference. In the beginning, I told you to make sure you remember that Yalta was in February, because here we have in July 1945 the Potsdam Conference. Now remember that the war was not totally over during the Yalta Conference. That is one of the reasons why Roosevelt wanted Stalin's help, is because when it's not quite over, he says, okay, I need your help. So in July 1945, the war was over. This is the final thing. And the big three met back together to discuss, okay, that was February, this is what we said, this is July, this is what we're actually going to do. But we had a little bit of problems between the two times. So just in the matter of, let's see, I guess that's 5 months, then a lot of things had changed. So the first one, Stalin had his Red Army firmly in Eastern Europe, and he insisted that the control was only defensive. And he's like, okay, I'm just here still to really protect these people and make sure that nothing ever happens. And instead of a provincial democratic government, a communist government was set up in Poland, and that was set up by Stalin. And the majority of people didn't want that, but Stalin really didn't care. Okay, so keep that in mind, that Stalin had his army firmly in Eastern Europe. That is actually the next video that I'll explain everything that happens there. But one of the big, huge things that happened is America had a new president. Roosevelt died. After 4 terms, almost 16 years, Roosevelt died and Truman replaced him. Truman was Roosevelt's vice president, so when Roosevelt dies, he just naturally becomes president. But Truman was a very anti-communist. And he saw the actions that Stalin had done by setting up his Red Army in Eastern Europe as very aggressive, and he really wanted to stop it. And also, America had tested an atomic bomb in July 1945 and had ended the war in Japan on their own with that atomic bomb. I'm sure that most of you know about the bombing of Hiroshima and oh, sorry, my brain has stopped. I can't think of the other city that we bombed. But anyway, so we dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and said, if you do not stop this war, we will drop another bomb. And the Japanese government didn't believe them, so we dropped a second bomb. But actually, I should go back. Before we dropped the bomb, we warned them and said, if you do not stop this war, we will drop an atomic bomb. And they did not believe them, so they dropped the first bomb. Then they said, if you do not stop this war, we will drop a second bomb. So they dropped a second bomb. And then they said, if you don't stop this war, we're going to drop a third bomb. And finally Japan said, ooh, we really don't want this. We've seen it twice. We're going to stop the war. Now, luckily for Japan, well, for America, that Japan did that because we only had 2 bombs. So that went really well for America, that bluff. But unfortunately, it went very bad for Japan. But since we had dropped those atomic bombs, and it stopped it, and so America did not actually need Stalin's help in order to end that war. Now my brain is also starting to think, I believe we had only tested the atomic bomb by July 1945. We dropped the bomb after that, but we had the atomic bomb. And as you can see right here, we have Truman, the new president, holding this atomic bomb, and it is private. Notice the 12 points of peace, and that's a little play on the 14th points of peace, so there's not actually as much peace as we want. And here Truman is saying, why can't we work together in mutual trust and confidence? So that is sarcasm at its best. That is not possible at this time with everything that is going on. And if you notice, so this is Stalin right here, but this man, you think, okay, who is that man? Well, this man is Clement Attlee, and he is the new Prime Minister of Britain because Churchill lost the re-election. Okay, so here we've got our big 3, and it's totally different big 3 than ever. We've got Truman, Attlee, and we have Stalin. Now Attlee, you only need to know his name for basically this, pretty much this discussion. His name does not really come up ever again, except for the fact that he did replace Churchill. So you do need to know it, but it won't be discussed a lot. So a big rivalry and suspicion starts between Truman and Stalin, and hence begins the Cold War. So in this Yalta conference, Potsdam conference, there is a lot of disagreement, and it's very simple. Stalin wanted to cripple Germany, and Truman did not want to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles. In reparations, Stalin wanted reparations for Russia. 20 million Russian soldiers died in the war, and Truman did not want to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles. He did not want this. In Eastern Europe, at Yalta, they all agreed that Eastern Europe would be a pro-Soviet government, so they would be a Soviet sphere of influence, but Truman was unhappy about the way it went and wanted to get a get-tough attitude towards Stalin. So again, here is showing that beginning of the Cold War. I know you guys agreed at this in Yalta, but I'm not really sure I like it that much. So let's, pause, and I'm going to get tough on you, and I'm going to see what's going to happen. So the outcomes, and so here is my first discussion of the zone of occupation in Germany. So here is, you've got Germany. Here's divided into the 4 zones. Now notice we are not talking much about France, but they do get a zone, so that way there are 4 sections, not just 3 sections. We've got the British zone, the American zone, and the French zone. And Munich, just to let you know, is in the American zone. And then we've got, this is the Soviet zone, and then we have Berlin right here. And hopefully you know all about the Berlin Wall that goes through Berlin. We will be discussing the split of Berlin and the Berlin Wall and all of those things to follow in the following chapters and sections. So the outcomes, it is split into 4 areas. They bring the Nazi war criminals and put them on trial. The Polish provisional government they hold free and unfattened elections as soon as possible, but as I say, the elections they hold are not very free, and they become very Polish centered and very communist centered. We will discuss that in another video. Okay, Russia was allowed to take reparations from the Soviet zone and 10% of all the industrial equipment from the Western zone as reparations. And the American and British areas could take reparations if they want. So actually this was a really smart way to do the reparations. Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead and pause and take notes here. Oh no, I realized I probably just didn't tell you to do it on that last section. Sorry about that. And that was a lot of information. I was probably just ready to move on. So pause here, take these notes down. If you didn't get them, other notes, I'll show you those really quick, and then you can pause there. So if you need these, go ahead and pause here. Okay, so here we go. We're back to the outcomes. Pause here. And then I will go on to the next slide. So, as a result, although Yalta had seemed successful, behind the scenes tension was growing, particularly about Poland. The relationship between the superpowers had worsened, and soon after Potsdam, Truman knew the Americans had tested the first atomic bomb, giving America a huge military advantage over everyone else. And here we've got Truman and Stalin playing chess with the world. What's going to happen? So pause here and get these notes.